Hello, I'm Dan Borscher. This is ABC News Mornings coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. The federal government is pushing for the biggest shake-up of electoral funding and disclosure laws in more than a decade. A bill to be introduced to Parliament next week would seek to limit how much a candidate can receive from a political donor to $20,000 per year. The amount a candidate can spend during a campaign would be capped at $800,000, and political parties would also face capped spending limits. Let's get reaction from Independent Senator David Pocock, who joins us now live from Canberra. Senator, welcome to the program. What is your reaction?
Morning, Dan. Well, the media would know a lot more about these proposed reforms and the detail of them. The Senate crossbench is yet to get a briefing, get any of the legislation. I think sounds like there's some really good things in this package. My concern is that it's pretty revealing that the major parties want to ram through electoral reform, which is really important, and it's important that we go through the detail, in 2 weeks when we've had housing legislation, cost of living measures, scams legislation held up in the Senate. Why are they so quick to move when it's in their interests, when they're going to get an extra $20 million per party at election time, and entrench incumbency, which is a real concern for me as a community independent.
Is that what you think this is about, of the political parties, the Labor government, wanting to entrench power and get more money out of this?
Well, from what we've seen, this would be $20 million per election cycle that the major parties get. Yes, there are spending caps per electorate, but there's also what seems to be up to $90 million that the major parties can spend on advertising across the country. That's a lot of advertising. And so we'll probably be in a situation where on safe seats, major parties won't spend much. They'll spend the maximum in marginal seats. And then they'll have this huge pot of money to run national advertising campaigns. And the thing the government will say is, well, you're in there. It shouldn't matter to you. And as an incumbent, this does probably work for me, but that's not my concern. My concern is that elections should be a contest of ideas. We should have a range of candidates actually fighting on the issues for their community. And from what I've seen, and I think from the tone and sort of the timing of this is really about entrenching the major parties, entrenching the duopoly at a time where Australians are wanting more competition.
And the minister, you might have heard just a moment ago, saying that this is really about making the system, the democratic system of Australia, stronger. Do you not think it's doing that?
Well, undoubtedly, there's some very welcome parts of this bill, lowering the disclosure threshold, real-time disclosures. These are good things. But to ram this sort of reform through the Parliament without enough scrutiny, of actually sending it to a Senate committee. The Shadow Attorney General, Michaelia Cash, constantly reminds the Senate that the devil is in the detail. And so I'm really keen to actually look at the detail of what they're proposing and what will that mean for our democracy. One of my concerns with this is that there doesn't seem to be anything around truth and political advertising, banning the use of generative AI and deepfakes, which are a huge risk to our democracy. And so essentially we're seeing the major parties wanting to give themselves each $20 million after each election and still continue to lie.
And that 20, I'm sure that both of the parties would reject that they lie, but that is your opinion, Senator. That $20 million that you're referring to, is that in relation to the increase or the proposed increase of the amount that a politician would get from each vote, from $3.35 to $5, as well as that administrative fee per sitting member of Parliament? Is that what you're referring to there?
Yeah, from the calculations we've done, if you bundle all that up, it's about $20 million per sort of the coalition and for Labor. And let's remember that a third of Australians are choosing to vote for candidates that are not part of the major parties. So why do we have electoral reform that's potentially going to be rammed through by the major parties when people on the crossbench, a third of the Parliament, hasn't seen any detail? The last briefing me and my office had on this was in June, and there were no details about what it would contain. And to come back to banning the use of generative AI, we have experts saying this is a problem. We're seeing it being used in elections around the world, and truth and political advertising. It is currently totally legal to lie in political ads as long as you have some sped up disclosure at the end. That doesn't cut it anymore. We need to be raising the standard, and I don't think this legislation even touches on that.
And Senator, my understanding is that these reforms wouldn't come into play for the next election that we're expecting in the next couple of months. Is that your understanding, that this is actually for the election that is after that?
That's correct. That's my understanding. And so what's the rush? Why are we seeing the major parties potentially doing a deal to ram through? You know, as Senator Farrell just said, this is a big bill, and he sort of held this really thick thing of pages. If there's so much detail in it, let's take the time. It's not coming until the next election. What we're seeing is the major parties terrified of a minority government. They are terrified of being held to account and actually having more voices from the community who are accountable to their community, who don't have to toe some, at times really dumb party line that doesn't actually resonate with Australians. And I'm concerned that this is a bit of a stitch up by the duopoly in the land of the duopolies.
So do you think that this is actually about locking in the two-party system and shutting out independent voices?
Well, I certainly think big parts of it are. Some are long overdue, and I applaud the Labor government for actually bringing forward long overdue things like real-time disclosures, lowering the disclosure threshold. We should know who's funding our elections. But to focus on electorate spending caps, but not mention the bit where the major parties will have up to $90 million to spend on national advertising campaigns, independents can't do that. And so why are we entrenching incumbency in a country that has a big problem with duopolies and a lack of competition? And you're seeing Australians say, actually, I want something different. And so I think we've really got to make sure that this strikes the right balance of having a level playing field, not locking in incumbency where you have all the resources and funds at your disposal, but for people who actually want to represent their community, it's going to be harder and harder.
Independent Senator David Pocock, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for your time.
Cheers. Thank you, Dan.
Overseas now, US President-elect Donald Trump has nominated Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to head the United States Federal Health Agency. RFK Jr. ran as an independent presidential candidate before ending his bid and joining the Trump campaign. Co-host of Planet America, John Barron, is with us to unpack it all. John, good morning. Let's start with RFK Jr. What does this mean?
It means, in the words of President-elect Trump, that Kennedy can go wild with America's health system. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is described, Dan, by many as an anti-vaxxer. He denies he's an anti-vaxxer. He is a vaccine sceptic. He says no vaccines are safe and effective. Safe and effective being kind of the legalese by which the Health and Human Services Department approves vaccines. He has said when he was running for president himself that he would like an 8-year pause on the development of new vaccines. He would like the focus to go from infectious diseases to chronic diseases. He points to environmental pollutants, chemicals that are in food, other things that he believes may be linked to a range of health conditions. He has falsely linked vaccines and other chemicals to autism. There is no research at all that says that is true. There was some widely discredited fake science in the late 1990s that once drew that link, and it's become basically a conspiracy theory ever since. So Kennedy has some way out of the mainstream ideas. He's a former environmental lawyer, long-time heroin addict, as well as being the son of Senator Robert Kennedy, who was killed running for the presidency himself in 1968. So he has a checkered career and a fixation on vaccines. This role will give him the power to stop the approval of any new vaccines that are developed by the likes of Pfizer or Moderna. So heaven help us if there is another pandemic while Robert F. Kennedy is in charge.
And are there any systems in place at the moment that would get around if he was to say that, to say, no, we are not going to be contributing or doing any research and development on further vaccines? Is the system robust enough to get around that, or no?
It's robust enough that the private sector can conduct that research, but they cannot put those vaccines into the marketplace, provide them for consumers without regulatory approval, and that has to come from Kennedy and Trump. So this is the major concern. It is also a concern that just by the very nature of Kennedy's scepticism, and many would say scepticism is good, but not if it's not based in medical science. Kennedy has in the past been blamed for literally dozens of deaths in, for example, American Samoa, when he went there 5 years ago and spread misinformation about the safety and efficacy of the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine. After his visit to that American territory, there was a drop in vaccination rates. The next year, there was an epidemic of measles. People died as a result. So Robert Kennedy is seen very much as a fringe figure who's been brought into the mainstream because he supported Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has basically made this deal, and he said as much publicly, as long as Kennedy doesn't campaign against fossil fuels, because Kennedy, being a former environmental lawyer, is also concerned about carbon pollution. But he says, as long as you let me drill and burn, then you can do what you like when it comes to the public health sector. Kennedy has promised what he's referring to as MAHA, Make America Healthy Again. And his defenders will say, well, there are concerns that there are additives in some American foods that could be contributing to obesity, could be contributing to heart disease. He might do some good, but anything he might do to reduce the amount of forever chemicals in the food chain or pesticides that have been banned in other countries would be more than overwhelmed by the sheer folly of banning proven, safe and effective vaccines, which is the very real danger now.
It feels like the world's in uncharted territory at the moment. There are reports also, John, about Elon Musk meeting with Iran's ambassador to the United Nations. What's this about?
This is a fascinating development, Dan, and it's interesting because Elon Musk has no government role. He has no official role. He is expected to be a part of a new Trump administration office, which is being called DOGE. It's about the Department of Government Efficiency, also named after an internet meme and Musk's own cryptocurrency. But Musk's role goes beyond that because Elon Musk is one of the few people in the world who can pick up the phone and speak not just to Donald Trump, but to Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. He is seen as a potential emissary. He's seen as possibly playing a key role in the future of some form of peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. The fears are that, like Trump, Musk is more predisposed to the concerns of Russia than Ukraine in all of this. That Musk is now in contact as an emissary to the Iranians to say, we would like to have better relations between the United States and Iran under a Trump administration. Well, that's OK, as long as it doesn't cross a line which says there's only one government at a time, one foreign policy at a time, and we don't want you interfering now in current Biden administration policy. Joe Biden's still the president until midday on the 20th of January. So this is a very fine line that is being walked, but it also suggests, Dan, that Elon Musk could very, very easily tread on the toes of the future Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for example. If Elon Musk can pick up the phone and talk to the Iranians, where does that leave Marco Rubio? Where indeed does it leave Donald Trump? So we have got this, the world's richest man wandering around Mar-a-Lago and the White House, potentially able to subvert or further American policy interests. The suspicion is, of course, that he's not really about America's interests, he is about Elon Musk's interests.
And have we seen response or reaction from Capitol Hill to any of this, to all of it, to some of it? It's all a bit chaotic, isn't it?
There has been a degree of shock, no doubt, at some of the more unconventional choices. Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, entirely mainstream, predictable, safe choice. In some ways at odds with Trumpism. He's more of a return to the sort of Bush, Romney, McCain era of the Republican Party. Putting forward as Director of National Intelligence former Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who was accused by Hillary Clinton of being a Russian asset. This is the head of the 17 American intelligence agencies. The former head of the CIA, Michael Hayden, basically concurring that she is a Russian asset. This is very, very serious stuff. Now, the United States Senate has to confirm most of these appointments. They go through a series of hearings and then they vote. They need a majority to do so. Republicans look like having 53 votes. They need a minimum of 50 votes plus one more from Vice President J.D. Vance. So they can only afford to lose 3 senators on any of these confirmations. If, for example, Matt Gaetz, who's being put forward as potential Attorney General of the United States, even though he is still under an ethics investigation by Congress for allegedly trafficking for sex an underaged girl, he may have difficulty getting those 50 votes, even in a very pro-Trump Republican Party right now. Trump has got other options. He can basically shove these appointments through when the Senate is in recess, a so-called recess appointment, where they can serve for 2 years in effectively an acting role. The Senate can counter that by saying, well, we're not going into recess. We will have one senator every 5 or so days come in, bang the gavel into session, bang it out of session again, and we're never in recess. That's if Republicans want to stop Trump, and that's the big question. Do Republicans, after winning this quite strong and quite unexpected victory, are they going to defy Donald Trump so early in his second term? Are they going to say, well, OK, we won't let you have Matt Gaetz, but you can have your next choice? And maybe this is a part of the game that Trump is playing. Put some radical choices out there first, then pull them back and put in the person you really want, who might have been controversial in ordinary circumstances, but at least they're not as bad as Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who are certainly way, way out of the mainstream, not qualified and in some ways problematic in the extreme in terms of their credentials and their opinions.
And just finally, John, there have been a whole raft of appointments since we last spoke. Are we getting more of an insight into the way that Donald Trump is shaping his cabinet and what his agenda is going to be for the next 4 years from January?
Yes. This is all of those who feared that Donald Trump, if re-elected, would have no guardrails whatsoever, no pushback from the people around him. That appears to be coming to fruition now. When Donald Trump was first elected, he didn't expect to win in 2016. When he came to office in 2017, because so many Republicans had publicly opposed him, he could not draw on many of the people who had served for Bush, had served for Reagan, had worked for Romney or McCain. He couldn't serve, they'd all spoken out against him and said he was unfit to be president. So he drew very heavily then from the military to fill a lot of those senior posts. Well, this time he's not going for military, he is going for absolute Trump loyalists. All of the people who, for the last 8 years, governors, think tankers, TV hosts, in the case of the future Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth, a TV host, are being put into these senior roles because, first and foremost, they may not be qualified, they may not even be sane, but they're Trump loyalists. They will do what Trump wants or be his proxies, because at the end of the day, Trump is not that interested in many parts of governing. He has the things that he is interested in, and then he likes to golf. And he's happy, though, to have acolytes who are in his mould to now pursue these broad policies and just to get on with it. And more than anything else, he's really looking for disruptors, people who are going to shake up the status quo and keep shaking it, because he only has 4 years left in politics. Then he's done. He can't run again. But what does he leave for the future? He wants to leave not just a Trump Republican Party, but a Trump America.
And one other thing that just jumped out at me is that we're probably going to see a shake-up in the military as well, aren't we? That Donald Trump has already made rumblings about some changes there.
Donald Trump doesn't understand that the military and the Department of Justice and the FBI and the CIA, for that matter, should all be independent from the president. He believes they should be his personal army, his personal private eyes, his personal spies. So any general who is not prepared to accept Trump's order to maybe use the military against the American people, which is something that he requested of his the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in his first term. Or indeed, to go even further, one doesn't even like to think about what the implications could be for the nuclear chain of command if Trump purges the career generals and imposes his own unqualified Trump acolytes into those roles. But it will politicise the military in a way that he would argue, well, the military's already politicised because a bunch of generals have been criticising me for years. So they started it. I'm going to finish it. He wants to purge any anti-Trump people from the military and put pro-Trump people in.
Wow. Well, I think your job of analysing and dissecting it all over the next 4 years is going to be busier than ever. John Barron, co-host of Planet America, good to have you along.
Thanks, Dan.
Back home, the Prime Minister says Australia is ready to exploit any move by the new Trump administration to walk away from action on climate change. Anthony Albanese is at the APEC summit in Peru, where he's talking up green tech investment opportunities here in Australia. The ABC's national political lead, David Spears, reports from Lima.
The Prime Minister, Dan, has had a couple of meetings here in Lima today, one with Peru's president, the host of the APEC summit, and, as you say, Prabowo Subianto, Indonesia's new president. Their first meeting since Subianto was, since his inauguration just a few weeks back. They talked about trade, they talked about military cooperation, and there are exercises going on in the Northern Territory at the moment involving Australia and Indonesia. Those sort of areas you'd expect. Then conversation turned to Donald Trump, and perhaps that's not surprising. I mean, this is coming up constantly amongst leaders who are gathering here at this first summit since the US election, trying to navigate what the second Trump presidency might be like and the big impacts we know that it could involve, given his promises to withdraw the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, dismantle the Biden-era Inflation Reduction Act, and on trade, sweeping new tariffs that he's promised as well. So, you know, this is going to have a huge impact, and leaders here are trying to work that through. When it comes to trade, there's a great deal of concern. But on climate, it's interesting. The Prime Minister is looking at potential upside for Australia. If there are no longer the big incentives for investors to pour money into the United States, well, come to Australia is his message. We have some incentives. We have the critical minerals. We have the solar and wind and so on. So he is trying to send a message to investors globally that have a look at Australia. Take a look.
Potentially, given Australia's position in the world and the resources that we have, there are potential benefits if there are changes in US policy.
And David, what else are Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's key priorities while there?
Look, he'll have further meetings on the sidelines and then in the sessions of APEC itself from tomorrow before heading to Brazil for the G20 summit, which will follow. He'll no doubt be hoping to meet with China's president as well as the current US President Joe Biden as well. But for all of his talks, it's a consistent theme that's emerging on maintaining support for free trade and for global momentum towards net zero emissions. I think we're starting to see at least, how Anthony Albanese is going to approach the new Trump administration, the second Trump administration. And that is, sure, he wants a positive relationship. He wants a deeper relationship between Australia and the United States. We know that's the plan under AUKUS. But maintaining consistency on Australia's policy principles when it comes to trade and climate, not folding simply because Donald Trump has a different view. And you can see there's political and economic sense behind that sort of approach for the Prime Minister. So I think that's been pretty clear in this first gathering of world leaders since the US election.